Ah, well, this is new, isn't it?
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The Grand Failure, Beyond the Streets.
Hello, and welcome back to the Grand Failure Beyond the Streets podcast, where for the last few months, this show has been covering all of the twists and turns held within our local elections. I'm your host, Rebekah Massie, and today I'm going to dive into and break down the results of our city's elections that were held back on July the 30th. Now, to be clear, this episode is not just going to be about who won and who lost. It's much more than that. It's about what these results signify in our community, how the future of our city is going to be shaped in these next 4 years, and really explaining how all of this sort of ties into the title of this episode, Dawning of a New Era. Because that's really, at the end of the day, what all of this means, a new era for Surprise. So let's go ahead and explore just exactly what this means for every single resident in our community. Before I get into the discussion of the election outcomes, let's take just a quick moment here to reflect on the candidates, their journeys, and everything that brought us here where we are today. Over the past few months, our city's election season could certainly be called a great many things. Dull is most definitely not one of them, however. Since about March of this year, the elections within Surprise have been heating up and have been chock full with things like mayoral debates. You had regular residents taking part in various social media debates and sometimes even fighting within the comments section. You had a couple of scandals, some investigations, and then, of course, the fallout from every single one of these sorts of events and the happenings within our city and where it sort of left the voters at the end of the day. As a reminder, we did have a total of 3 council seats that were up for grabs, all of which were uncontested. Those races were for District 2, District 3, and District 4. The mayoral race was honestly the primary source of drama, as it were. There were a total of 3 candidates vying for the position, 2 of which were on the ballot, 1 that was registered as a write-in candidate. All but one of these races did not have an incumbent running, and the mayoral race only had 1 candidate that was a sort of veteran candidate, if you could even say that. And what I mean is only 1 out of the 3 total mayoral candidates had actively served as an elected official in our city government. The other 2 had not served in an elected capacity before. This meant going into the election, right, no matter how the votes got sliced, we were bottom line going to have at least 2 newcomers or new faces on the council and a brand new individual serving as our mayor once January comes around and they're sworn into office. Don't worry, though. I'll be sure to elaborate here in a bit as to why really I feel that this is as big of a deal as it is and what that means for the council moving forward as it pertains to local governance. The election cycle also had the Surprise 2040 general plan on the ballot, in addition to the candidates that I just mentioned a moment ago. And as we get more into the outcomes, I hope y'all will come to view this in the same way that I do, which is a true, honest-to-God turning point within the community of Surprise, Arizona. Well, hopefully this goes without saying, but in case you did not know, the election results are in. It's over. The fat lady has sung, so to speak, anyhow. July 30th was our city's election day. Maricopa County has finished tallying all of the results, and the city council actually just met this past Monday, August 12th, in a special session that was called specifically to canvass the election outcome. In case you're unfamiliar with the election and the canvassing process more specifically, what that means is an elected body, typically a council for a municipality or the board of supervisors in the case of a Maricopa County-wide election, they hold a process, which is a little bit of a formality, but it is required by law nonetheless. And that process is where they meet and a motion is made to officially ratify or canvass the results of the tabulated votes. So without further ado, let's go ahead and go over the data from the recorded ballots that were cast in our city. I'm sure it's going to come as no shock to anybody that the 3 council seats that were up for grabs were all filled by the single and solitary candidate that was running for each of those 3 offices in that district. Now, I said before there was only one incumbent running. That was Mr. Patrick Duffy. So Patrick Duffy is currently serving for District 3, and he has been reelected to serve in District 3 for the next 4 years, beginning in January. Now, what this does mean for Districts 2 and Districts 4, so Allie Klein, because she was running for mayor, could not run for re-election in District 2 serving as a council member. So somebody else had to step up to the plate, take on that responsibility. Mr. Earl Greenberg is now officially considered to be the council member-elect for District 2, and he was who was running, again uncontested, in that District 2 race. For District 4, Councilmember Remley is retiring at the end of the year. He had decided that a little bit ago, and the newcomer, Johnny Melton, Mr. Johnny Melton, is now officially the council member elect for District 4. Now, what I do find surprising about these 3 races, surprising, see what I did there? Okay, anyways, puns and dad jokes aside, what I do find a little bit surprising, intriguing, however you'd like to phrase it, is the voter turnout within the districts. Now, the turnout for Districts 3 and District 4 were pretty close, little less, but pretty close to the overall turnout in our citywide elections, and more on those citywide elections here in a moment. But what's very interesting to me is District 2 had almost double the turnout of the other 2 districts. Mr. Greenberg had a total of 6,829 votes cast for him, which equates to about 53% of the registered voter populace in that district. Councilmember Duffy had 3,896 votes cast for him, which equated to about 28%. And Mr. Melton had 3,039 votes cast, which was about 29% for his district as far as turnout goes. So you can kind of see, right? You've got high 20s and then low 50s. It's very close to almost double the turnout in District 2. And from my understanding, historically, District 2 does have the largest turnout of any council district in our city. I promised I'd talk about the citywide elections, so let's go ahead and dive into those. The mayoral election, in my opinion, is where things get a bit more interesting. And what I mean by that is for both the mayoral race and the 2040 plan, i.e. both of our citywide elections, we had a voter turnout of 30,666 ballots cast, which is almost a 33% voter turnout rate. Now, I don't feel like I have to explain this or beat a dead horse about it, but 33% voter turnout rate is not great by any stretch of the definition of the word great, but nevertheless, the results are official at this point. They've been canvassed. If you recall seeing the news, or even what I mentioned just a few moments ago in this episode, we had 3 candidates running for the office of mayor. The votes wound up being split as followed. So the write-in, Mr. Ed Cunningham received 1,570 votes, which is about 5.5% of the vote. Typically, you only see a write-in candidate get about 1 to 3% of the vote in most cases. So Ed actually got, kudos to him for how he and his campaign folks ran the election. They did a great job. They got, I would say, at least double what was probably expected. Again, historical averages taken into account here. Councilmember Allie Klein received 9,433 votes, which equated to about 33% of the total ballots cast. And then we have our now mayor-elect, Mr. Kevin Sartor, who was able to obtain 17,541 votes, which is a little over 61% of the vote. And where this breakdown becomes important was because we had a split of 3 candidates. The way that the city runs their elections is they run it concurrent with the Arizona State primary election, assuming that there are only 2 candidates and one gets a majority vote, that election is decided. In the event that you have a 3-way split or multiple candidates running for a single seat and not one candidate gets greater than 50% of the vote, something happens called a runoff election, which means the top 2 candidates move forward. The bottom candidate, had this happen with the 3 candidates in the mayoral election, the bottom candidate would have been dropped, the top 2 would have proceeded to November, and then November would have decided the fate of the mayoral seat, as it were. Now, that didn't happen. which is pretty incredible considering we did have 3 candidates. And again, there was a ton of buzz going around about the mayoral election. So for a single candidate to not only secure over 50% of the vote, but be able to grab 61% of the votes that were cast in total is a huge margin in a victory standpoint and being elected. So kudos to Mr. Sartor for running the campaign that he did. Kudos to the volunteers. Full disclosure, I was one of the volunteers. I know that that's not super secret, but I can honestly say that the core group that was moving his campaign forward, it wasn't any one of us that moved everything forward. It was a collective effort, and it was really great to see that sort of grassroots effort happening right in our own backyards in our city. The final result that I want to go over is the 2040 general plan. So this was the only other citywide election item, and it did pass. Spoiler alert, it passed. Okay. The votes that were against it were 9,499, or about 45% of the votes that were cast for this particular measure. And then the votes cast in favor were 11,622 votes, or about 55% of the total votes cast. Now, you're probably thinking, Rebekah, we had about 30,000, almost 31,000 ballots cast for the mayoral race, and 11,000 and 9,000 is only about 20,000. So where did the other 10,000 votes go? This was kind of, and not to completely go off the rails here in the topic of conversation today, but just to illustrate a point, the 2040 ballot measure, general plan, whatever we want to call it, was actually on the back of your ballot. You had to physically turn your ballot over, and it was after all of the partisan elections, after council member seat, if that was up for grabs in your district, and after the mayoral seat. Now, between you and me, I feel like there was definitely a space that the 2040 plan could have gone on the front of the ballot. That's just me. I feel like it was kind of at a disadvantage being on the back of the ballot, especially when there's no sort of like flashing arrow or anything like that going, hey, you're not done, turn it over type of a thing. Be that as it may, the people have spoken. It has passed. Personally, I was against the plan, and I can probably do a whole other episode on that in the future. But for the sake of time today and sticking to my script, my plan for this episode, we're going to go ahead and move on. I think that the numbers speak for itself, that if we had only 2/3 of the vote cast for the 2040 general plan that were cast for the mayor, clearly there was some sort of disconnect there. And so that's feedback that, of course, hopefully moving forward, the next time there's something along the lines of this sort of a situation on the ballot, that whomever's in charge of approving the ballots for the city, we can try to have it a little bit more obvious. And if there's a legal requirement that it has to be in a separate section, okay, fine. We need to make sure that we call out, hey, there's a question on the back, right? If there's not a legal requirement, then just bump it up to the same page if it can all fit. Anyways, that's my 2 cents on it. So let's go ahead and move right into the outcomes and explanations thereof. Okay, so I said I'd explain the outcomes, and now that I've reported, let's really dig into what this means for our city. I said before, right, going into this election season, it was very clear that there were bound to be at least 2 fresh faces in City Hall and council chambers next year, but we weren't quite sure what else would unfold from here. The results are in, you just heard them for yourself, and you can even review the results on your own if you'd like. The canvass results are on the special city council meeting agenda in the files for the meeting dated August the 12th, 2024 on the city's website. The city received this information from the county. You can also take it a step further and go look at the results directly with Maricopa County. And the county's website for this is elections.maricopa.gov. Again, elections.maricopa.gov. And don't worry, I'll be sure to link both the agenda and the county site on thegrandfailure.org too, specifically under this episode's information in the podcast section on the website. But with all of these results, the people have spoken, and they've spoken indeed. These 3 newly elected city officials are going to be sworn in office in early January. The way that it's written in the municipal code is as soon as is feasible after the first of the year. And once that is done, that's going to mark the official shifting of leadership into the surprise city council. And in my opinion, this isn't just a changing of the guard, so to speak. This is, I think, truthfully, a bit of a complete paradigm shift as to what the residents want to see within our community. They want new and different mindsets. They want more diverse backgrounds. And most of all, the residents want a group of leaders who campaigned primarily on things like trust, ethics, transparency, accountability, and those same leaders that they voted for have expressed commitments to addressing the issues that we face daily in our community, and that is what the people said when they cast their ballots. Now, just because the election is over does not mean that it is time to celebrate. There's work yet to be done. Our new leaders are going to be stepping into their roles after the new year, and they will then be facing the everyday complaints and issues that our current council faces today. And this even includes where this little podcasting journey began, meaning our traffic, our infrastructure, and public safety concerns. With the rapid expansion happening around the city, particularly in District 1, near the Loop 303 and Grand Avenues, that whole area, this next iteration of city council certainly is going to have their work cut out for them. And where, in my opinion, they need to differentiate themselves from prior councils is they need to strive to do more research. They need to be more involved at the ground levels. And this means that they can and should review recent decisions made within the city to ensure that with this new era that we're heading into, all of the policies, procedures, commissions, boards, and any other inner workings of our city align with this new leaf we've turned over. And to be clear, they still need to operate within the confines of the law. There are certainly things that are a what's done is done type of a situation, but things that can be reviewed, in my opinion, should, especially in this last 6 to 12 months, we'll say, of the current city council. As we heard even just the last city council meeting in early August, not the special session, but the one prior, there were numerous commission spots that were affirmed, and 2/3 of that nomination council are lame ducks, for lack of a better word. You can do the research on your own. I don't want to get too much into the weeds on that. But things of that nature, especially since all of those commission positions, for the most part, were ratified or confirmed for 5 years, which is atypical. But what the city clerk was trying to do was not have this sort of a thing come up in an election year again. So I understand I would have gone with 3, but that's neither here nor there. They went with 5 so that it doesn't wind up with an election cycle. Those are the types of things that, because those commissions work at the behest of the council, those should be reviewed. Things like, I know the 2040 plan has been approved by voters, but that's really just kind of like the skeleton or the framing, so to speak, of the direction that the city has gone. There's still a lot of things that it's open to interpretation and whatnot. And so those are the things that we need to kind of reflect on and see, does this make sense? Again, all within the confines of the law, but let's move on. So those challenges that I mentioned a moment ago, reviews, things of that nature, all of that aside, I believe truly and honestly that this election is a serious milestone in our city's history. Granted, it's not quite history yet. We're currently living in it, but I do strongly feel that this is going to be one to be remembered. Or, at least that's my hope, right? I feel strongly that this is indeed the case because looking at the breakdown of these votes that were cast, particularly in the mayoral race, not only did we manage to avoid any sort of runoff election that I talked about earlier, so we prevented that from occurring, but in a 3-candidate race, the leader amongst the pack, so to speak, that is now our mayoral-elect, received nearly double the amount of votes that the next closest candidate received. That speaks volumes, and I'm not just talking about in the vote counts either. Our community banded together when they did their civic duty and voted. And we spoke loud and we spoke clear against the status quo to lead our city for the next 4 years. We all wanted something new. We wanted something different. And I'd like to think that it's time that the city starts to look at repaying that ask in kind. Surprise, specifically the government entity, right, is really and truthfully at a crossroads. It has been this entire election season. Now that the decisions have been made, we're still at the same crossroads, but instead, we have a little bit more guidance and a little bit more insight as to where we're headed, because now we know who is going to be at the helm and who is going to be assisting with the steering, the direction that we now go. The last few episodes that I published on this podcast were focused on the candidates that were running for office. I'm going to shamelessly plug my own content here, so apologies. But I am going to go ahead and say right now that if you have not listened to those episodes, you should 100% do so. Reason being is, in speaking with those candidates that I interviewed, all of them had something to say about the need for transparency. And that is what this new era of leadership needs to really use as their North Star here in guiding the decisions that they make. There's a saying out there that goes, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. That should be the focus. Learning about recent and even some more historical downfalls of our local government, how they unfolded, how they were dealt with, and then sort of take a Monday morning quarterback approach. Hey, it's fall. Don't come at me for the football references. I'm excited. But again, look at how things were unfolded. Look at how it was dealt with. Take that Monday morning quarterback approach and review them. This context and review is a crucial part of being able to really dissect an event and learn from it. In project management, this is often referred to as one of two things, depending on whether or not the project was successful. If the project failed, it's typically referred to as a postmortem, i.e., the project is dead. We need to know why it went wrong, kind of like an autopsy, right? If there's a suspicious death or something of that nature, trying to figure out the root cause of what happened to that individual that is no longer with us. In the case that a project is successful, and technically this can be used in the event of either a failure or a success, but from my experience, it's typically used more commonly when the project is a success, and that is called a retrospective. If you're unfamiliar with those project management terms, let me give you a very, very brief, we'll call it extremely brief, crash course on them. We'll start with retrospective. So retrospective are used in project management to review the positives and the negatives within a particular project, or even at times within a particular sprint or segment, specific milestone achievement of a larger project, depending on what's going on. And this allows the project team, potentially the stakeholders, and we don't just mean the internal stakeholders, but any external stakeholders sometimes are put through the retrospective process, and then any other individuals that may have been involved in the project work. The retrospective allows that group of people to review and go over the project work, review the timelines, review the deliverables, the successes, the failures, and then typically what happens at the end of all of this is it's summarized and it's put into a document, typically a lessons learned document, and it covers this process, covers this analysis, and then it's put to bed or laid to rest, if we're going to stick with perfect segue for postmortem. But anyway, so retrospective document, lessons learned, put to rest, right? So now that I'm segueing into postmortem, again, this is previously used when a project is not successful, meaning it was a failure. I personally am of the mindset that failure can often be the greatest teacher. However, in order to learn, you must be willing to listen. The postmortem process is an analytical approach to why a particular project, or even theoretically, a milestone or a sprint within a project was considered a failure. It can include, and honestly really should include, anything and everything that could have or did likely play a part into the failure. This could range from some sort of a disaster scenario, think server failure, server crashing in the IT space that was completely unexpected, no backup, something of that nature, or in, say, a construction project, building project, some sort of natural disaster taking out the construction or something, earthquake, fire, whatever it is, right? It could also include things like interpersonal conflicts, which can occur, right, if the team involved in the project does not go through the phases of actually coming together as a team. More on that in a bit. Or it could include any vast number of other things. The important piece is, once again, to document these issues, document how they were handled, and then either A, take what did work out for the next time, or B, never repeat those same mistakes again. Like I said, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Okay? It goes without saying realistically that the city should regularly be taking these sorts of approaches, in my opinion anyhow, and that there should be some sort of thorough documentation of all of these processes, not just to reflect right on how things went, but also to look for places to create or enhance efficiencies along the way next time there's a similar project. However, in order to do that, there has to be trust in an organization, much like there needs to be trust within a core project team for any sort of project that they are taking on. And I think as of late, there's been a little division within City Council. We could probably have a whole episode dedicated to that. But I think that's kind of where you started to see some of the breakdown in decisions that were made and whatnot in the last few months, at least in my opinion, of the current sitting council. So I mentioned the current city council, and as I move into the next segment here, which I'm going to call passing the baton, I want to go back just a moment here to when I was speaking in terms of project management. More specifically, when I mentioned teams, or in this case, our city government having trust. A lot of this groundwork to achieve trust is laid in the months leading up to the new officials being sworn into office, or in my opinion, that is when it should begin happening. And this is where the existing officials have a chance to leave a parting gift, as it were, for the newcomers, and that being their knowledge, any expertise that they have in the field, and so forth, that they want to bestow upon the newcomers as they leave their elected offices at the end of the year. And what I want to take another offshoot here and talk about is the stages of team development and project management. So there are technically a total of 5 stages, but at the original inception, there were 4 phases. We'll go over the 4 phases here in a moment. And those stages were originally developed, just to give you some historical context, they were originally developed by a man named Bruce Tuckman in the year 1965. The 5th stage was added in 1977 when Mr. Tuckman collaborated with a Mary Ann Jensen, and together they added this final stage. The stage that the existing officials are in or should be in is called adjourning. And this is the stage where the team disbands at the end of a project. They should be celebrating the successes, capturing lessons learned from their time spent together. And again, I'm not going to beat a dead horse, but that sounds an awful lot about what I just spent the last couple minutes explaining to you all, right? So anywho, that is where the current city council should be at. Now, I mentioned the newcomers, right? And in the months leading up to them taking office, they start to get things like getting looped into meetings, getting looped into the city staff, and so forth. And once these newcomers begin to onboard a bit with the city and get looped into all of these things, what they're doing is preparing for their eventual taking of office officially and being sworn in. And what should start to happen for this new collective group is to begin their own stages of team development. For the sake of naming segments, since apparently I'm on a roll with that today, we're going to call this one starting off on the right foot. In order to start off right, what the newcomers should be doing in conjunction with those remaining members of council who are staying past the end of the year, they should be beginning their own team development stages. And again, these original 4 stages were developed in 1965 by Tuckman, and they are as follows: forming, storming, norming, and performing. Don't worry, I'll break these down for you all as well. Sorry you're getting a crash course in project management today, but I feel that it is pertinent to successfully coming into this new era, as it were. The first stage of team development is forming, and that is where the team comes together, they review each other's strengths and weaknesses, expertise, and really any other information about one another. They're often going to test the waters, see where they fit in the team dynamic, and normally the project manager, which is what I do professionally, is responsible at this stage to set goals, review objectives, establish norms and guidelines for working together as a team, and so forth. Now, in our city government, the project manager role is kind of co-parented a bit, and it's co-parented by both the mayor, who serves as the chair during council meetings, and the city manager, who is responsible in the more administrative sense of the city versus the policy or legislative sense, which is what the council does. There's an excellent resource available on the website for the League of Arizona Cities and Towns. I'll be sure to link that in the podcast episode info as well for those who'd like to look a bit more into the context of a council manager or manager council government and how those groups work together. But that's the first stage. The second stage, storming, is typically, in my opinion, the most trying of the 4 stages. The team members are often going to go through power struggles, and yes, I mean plural, sometimes it's more than one. And this is the time where differences of opinion tend to surface the most, and things kind of tend to bubble up to the surface or come to a head the most. And more often than not, what the team needs to do is work through what conflict resolution looks like within the group. The project manager's role in all of this, specifically the storming stage, is to bring the team together And ideally, the PM is responsible for making sure that the team members understand and respect one another. They are there to facilitate conversations. They're there to aid in conflict resolution and the like. In our city's case, the mayor and the city manager are going to need to ensure that the team appreciates different perspectives brought forth in these conversations and sometimes even heated debates. The key here is consistency and not imparting their own personal biases into the conversation or the issues at hand, as really all that can do is serve to further polarize members within the group and is counterproductive to ensuring that all voices are heard. To do that, what our city does, whether it's a public meeting or a private meeting or executive session, as it were, they use Robert's rules. There are a ton of resources out there about Robert's rules, but the gist of it is essentially Robert's rules are essentially rules of decorum that, in theory, and when applied appropriately in practice as well, they're guidelines for respectfully debating and conversing about motions on the table, ensuring all voices are heard, and even though equal time is given to both sides of an issue, ultimately allowing the majority to rule or make the decisions. So you can see how conflict resolution really becomes key when it comes down to making a decision for the city. The next stage, again, the third stage, is called norming. And this third stage is where the team finally begins to actually come together and work more as a collective group. There's a lot more trust, or there should be a lot more trust at this stage, and that's typically due to the conversations being held in the previous two stages, the forming and storming, as it were. The group is able to work through issues, disagreements, resolve differences, and the project manager, again in the city's case, the mayor and the city manager, work together to ensure that the team, in this case the council, continues to perform, gain more of a rhythm or a momentum in their daily work, and in theory, the group should also require far less oversight and involvement from either of the so-called project managers within our city at this time. Now, that's not to say that the mayor and the manager aren't involved. They're just involved at more of a peer level, particularly the mayor, versus a leadership level. Again, the mayor's still the chair, they're still the figurehead, but it's less of a authoritative and more of a peer level of leadership, if that makes sense. And then, of course, the city manager is there for the operations and administrative piece. The fourth and final stage is called performing. And this is where the team, in our city government's case, the council, should be operating at the highest of levels. They are no longer individuals, but a collective group. Now, that is not to say that each council member and in turn the district that they represent does not have a unique voice, read list of concerns, grievances, whatever, right? But the focus is decidedly less on a specific sector or person or district or area or issue and so forth, but more on benefiting the city as a whole. Now, at times, if we're being honest, that could look like a particular area or a particular set of areas seem to be getting more attention than the others. But the conversation around these sorts of things is really what sort of changes and where the focus winds up being the strengthening, let's say in the city example, right? The strengthening of the overall design and the culture, look, feel, amenities, and so forth of the city of Surprise. Now, a prime example of this would be in areas that are less developed than others, say District 1, for example, bringing up the traffic controls, the roadways, the amenities, the businesses, and so forth up to par with the look and feel of other areas around the city. That's how cities grow and mature. It's just how it works. For those that have been in Arizona for a long time, turn back time a little bit, think about the area, say, around Happy Valley and the I-17. Not too long ago, that was practically the middle of the desert in the middle of nowhere. Now it's a booming area and very well-developed area of North Phoenix. It's got houses, schools, shops, entertainment areas, medical facilities, and more. Overall, the building up of that area has benefited the northern part of Phoenix as it expanded, and Surprise should be striving to do the same. During this phase, what happens is the project managers, again, the mayor and the city manager, should be even more hands-off from a leadership perspective and only stepping in when there's a certain higher level of decision that's required to be made. And it should be noted that because the mayor sits as the seventh council member and casts the legislative or policy-based votes, that overall throughout these phases, like I mentioned it before and kind of touched on it a little bit at the end of the last point, right? The mayor should be shifting into more of a peer-to-peer leadership role versus a leader who's assuming command. The day-to-day operations, once again, are going to fall more onto the city manager's shoulders, and the mayor should be responding and adjusting their own scope of support in kind. Once again, mayor is still the figurehead. They are still the ceremonial head of the city. But that doesn't mean that they place themselves above the council, either literally or figuratively. There's something to be said when moving into the norming and the performing stages as a project manager that you adopt more of a servant style of leadership and the way that you work with the group adjusts in kind versus ordering the group around. That is how, in my opinion, the council should be working together and striving to work together in conjunction with the city manager as they move through these phases. And really, what's important here is nobody's necessarily above anybody else. The hierarchy kind of dissolves and they are a collective group and a collective team. The divisiveness should be stopping. Now, that's not to say that you still can't debate the issues or have disagreements or have differing views on how something should be done, especially on a contentious issue, say like budgeting, tax rates, things of that sort that we've seen in recent months with the city. But what that does mean is the level of trust and the caliber at which they are operating with, and they meaning the council, the team, is far more akin to a well-oiled machine versus something that you need to oil the gears every day to get to turn on type of a thing. And what I mean by that is, yes, the mayor is still the chair of the council. They still have some certain roles and responsibilities as outlined in our city municipal codes as to what the role of the mayor encompasses. But in my opinion, it should be more of a servant style leadership. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the mayor can't delegate things. It just should be a far more collaborative approach versus what we've kind of seen over the last several months with the current mayor, where it just kind of seems like, I don't want to say barking orders, that's probably not the right word for it, but it's more of a, hey, this is what we're doing type of a thing versus a, hey, what would you like to do, or where do you think you're best utilized type of a thing. And that's where in knowing, in getting to know Kevin over these last several months working on his campaign, I truly feel that that's the approach that he's going to take. That's the approach that people want him to take based on feedback that I've heard all over social media and at various events and whatnot with him. And in talking with some of the sitting council members that are still serving out their term, and talking with Patrick Duffy when I interviewed him for the podcast, and in talking with Johnny Melton when I interviewed him for the podcast, that is really where everybody kind of aligned most outside of the transparency and outside of some of the alignment that we saw on what the most commonalities or what the commonalities were, I should say, with main issues that our city is facing. It was a lot about working together and not letting egos get in the way. And I think that the way, I'm going to say it again, right? The way that the people have spoken is what the people are looking for. And so I'll leave you with that thought as I go ahead and wrap up here today. And as I wrap up, I truly hope that you found this episode both interesting and enlightening. This is what I'm hopeful for our new era of city council and what I'm hoping that they're going to be able to bring to the table. And even more importantly, the great thing about this process is it's very easily replicated and repeated each election cycle. It can even be used or an abridged version of it used if there's any other staffing changes. Say, if for some reason there's a new city manager, new city clerk, new city attorney, or any other members of hired staff within the city, or even in appointed or volunteer type of a position, like some of the commissioners that were most recently confirmed and nominated to move into, say, planning and zoning and library and veterans committees, things of that nature, right? So as we enter into this new timer period, new era, whatever we want to call it, right? I'm truly and honestly excited for what these fresh perspectives are going to be able to bring to the table, where our city is going to be able to go from here. And as we move through these next few months waiting for the new folks to take office, I'll of course be sure to keep you all abreast of the key topics and opportunities for community involvement and ways that we can honestly just keep this conversation and this momentum going. If you have not already done so, now would be the perfect time to go back and listen to all of the other episodes in this inaugural season of the Grand Failure Beyond the Streets podcast, particularly as this next episode, which is going to be episode 12, so this is episode 11, next episode will be episode 12, if you can believe that. That is going to be the official season finale of this podcast. So season 1 finale, if you can believe it. You're not going to want to miss it, I promise. And in the meantime, either between now and the season finale drops, or in the small hiatus, if we can even call it that, that I'll take in between season 1 and season 2, you are more than welcome to reach out to me directly, either via the contact form on my website, which is thegrandfailure.org. That's thegrandfailure.org. So thegrandfailure.org. Under the About section, there's a contact form. Or you can reach out via email to contact@thegrandfailure.org. That's contact@thegrandfailure.org. If you're more of a people person and you'd prefer to chat via phone, in person, virtual meeting, anything else like that, and just kind of have a little bit of FaceTime or even just phone time where we can hash some things out or discuss, I'm up for that as well. It will be pending my availability. So if that's your preference, I'm open to it. Just contact me using one of those aforementioned methods. So email or the contact form, and I'll work with you to schedule something. I would truly love to hear from the community and my listeners as to what topics should be covered next season. And hey, even if you'd like to be a guest, by all means, feel free to reach out to me about that too. If you've got something to say, let's talk about it. Anywho, that's all for today, folks. This is your host, Rebekah Massie, signing off. Until next time, surprise.
Quick disclaimer before the credits roll. This episode was recorded during the weekend of August 17th and 18th. The original intended publication date was meant to be on August 20th. Recent events have delayed the posting of this episode and may result in this episode, Dawning of a New Era, being the season finale for the Grand Failure podcast.
End of transmission.
You're listening to The Grand Failure Beyond the Streets, a podcast about the ongoing public safety crisis in Surprise, Arizona.
The Grand Failure podcast is hosted, edited, and produced by Rebekah Massie. Jonathan Perry is credited with the voiceover and announcement work. I'd like to thank Spotify for podcasters as the hosting and distribution platform, and the folks over at Audacity with the open source software that made the production and editing of this podcast possible. Any graphics, logos, or artwork used to promote or identify the podcast was created by Rebekah Massie using the Canvas software. Sound effects, music, and more are provided courtesy of freesound.org, a website that offers royalty-free Community Commons licenses for a variety of sound bites, songs, and effects. Any sources, news articles, or other information will be linked on the webpage dedicated to the Grand Failure podcast on thegrandfailure.org. That's thegrandfailure.org. I'd also like to thank the local political action committee in the area, or PAC, by the name of Voices Surprise, for their partnership and efforts on my podcast, as well as give a quick shout out and thank you to my husband, Brian Massie, who has graciously put up with my work on this endeavor. Thank you all for your time, and for all of the podcast credits, details, and information, once again, they can be found on the website, thegrandfailure.org.